Namaskar. Good morning. Today is Mother's Day. So, my affectionate and respectful namaskars to all the dear Matajis here. A few weeks ago, we took up for discussion an important theme, very important for spiritual seekers like us. I mean, for those who find themselves in our situation. How to combine life in the world with our spiritual aspirations. It's an eternal challenge, a question that never seems to lose its relevance to us. And since most of us here happen to be devotees of Sri Ramakrishna, who is being universally acknowledged as God's incarnation in the present age, it is only natural, it is only proper that we should try to look for a solution in his teachings. As we already heard, Sri Ramakrishna said two things in answer to the question of how we ought to live in the world. Live in the world like a maidservant, and live in the world like the mudfish. He used to say, live in the world like a maidservant in a rich man's house. A maidservant in the house of a rich man performs all the household duties, but her thoughts are fixed on her own home in her native village. She brings up her master's children as if they were her own. She even speaks of them as my Ram or my Hari. But in her own mind, she knows very well that they don't belong to her at all. And Sri Ramakrishna also used to say, live in the world like a mudfish. The mudfish lives in the mud, but itself remains unstained. The mud is there, and the fish has to live in it, but its body is not stained by the mud. Its skin is always bright and shiny. You should live in the world in a spirit of detachment. You will no doubt have dirt on your body, but you must shake it off as the mudfish shakes off the mud. Let me repeat something we heard last time. Apparently, these two teachings are similar to each other, almost identical. Still, if we want to look for a difference, we can find one. But the difference is not in the essence of the two teachings, it is where the emphasis seems to be. In the maidservant analogy, it's on duty, and in the mudfish analogy, it is on detachment. That said, whatever difference we may think there is between them is anyway of no practical consequence. The lesson is we have to do our duty, but it has to be done with devotion and detachment. We've already discussed the first, the maidservant analogy. In that discussion, we learned about half a dozen things. One, what real duty is. Two, how many different kinds of duties there are. Three, what the supreme duty of human life is. Four, the conditions and requirements that need to be met before duties can be properly fulfilled. 5. The pitfalls and dangers that lie on the way. 6. The conflicts that will have to be faced and resolved. And 7. The need for a spiritual ideal and a spiritual outlook on life. The main takeaway from that discussion was duty is that which helps us in our spiritual progress. Non-duty is what prevents or retards that progress. And always, the lower self has to be sacrificed for the higher self. If we do that, then we rise step by step to higher and higher forms of duty. In the end, all duty drops off, and what is left is only loving service to the divine in all, in a spirit of perfect self-surrender and self-forgetfulness. Now, today, let us take up the mudfish analogy, and try to learn how to live in the world like the mudfish. Live in the world, but remain unstained. Holy Mother Sri Sarada Devi observed more than once that renunciation is the central theme of Sri Ramakrishna's life and teaching. Renunciation of lust, greed, and egotism. This threefold renunciation is what Sri Ramakrishna stressed most. A disciple once asked her, "But Mother, wasn't it in order to demonstrate the harmony of all religions that the Master came this time?" And Mother says, "I never felt that the Master practiced the different religions with the intention of teaching their harmony. He always was immersed in God consciousness. He followed the disciplines of different religions for the sake of God realization, in order to enjoy the bliss of God in different ways. But you know, my child, this time renunciation has been his specialty. Has anyone ever seen this kind of spontaneous renunciation? What you said about the harmony of religions is true. In other incarnations, other ideals were emphasized, but this time he has shown the ideal of renunciation." And she says something surprising. It is quite natural that people forget God. Surprising because Mother herself says that. It is quite natural that people forget God. So whenever the need arises, God himself incarnates on earth and shows the path by himself practicing sadhana. Holy Mother says, it is quite natural that people forget God. But Sri Ramakrishna used to find it very strange that people suffer so much in the world but still don't come to their senses. The whole world is so bound by the desire for enjoyment. People make money and pleasure the goal of their life and come to grief in the end. By too much attachment to this false world, they get so involved in it that they create no end of misery for themselves. Some people even seem to thrive on suffering and misery. Sri Ramakrishna used to compare them to a camel. The camel eats thorny leaves and bleeds in its mouth, but it keeps eating them all the same. But we here, we spiritual aspirants, we cannot live like that. We have fixed for ourselves a higher goal, and we can't afford to lose ourselves in the world. So we need to think deeply about renunciation and detachment. Why did Sri Ramakrishna lay so much stress on renunciation? The reason is, without renunciation, there can be no spiritual life. God cannot be seen. And renunciation means not only outward renunciation, but also mental renunciation. The renunciation Sri Ramakrishna had in mind is more mental than merely outward. Sooner or later, one has to give up attachment even to one's own personality and to that of others. One has to become truly dispassionate and detached in every way. It's not enough to be unattached to some things and people and remain attached to others. It's easier to give up what we don't like and imagine it is renunciation. True renunciation is a change of attitude towards everything and everybody. So, why is renunciation necessary? Why should we practice so much dispassion and non-attachment? Because spiritual disciplines cannot be successfully practiced without giving up all old associations which are not helpful to us. We can live a truly spiritual life and make progress only to the extent we are prepared to give up our desires and passions, to the extent we are prepared to renounce our attachments and aversions. We must always be alert, never to let our mind cheat us on this point. The mind always brings up some reason or other that we can't give up this thing or that it is our duty to be concerned about this person or that. It is all right as far as it goes, but we must be careful because the mind is most of the time the spokesman of our own hidden desires and motives. That is why we need not only spiritual disciplines like prayer and meditation, but also renunciation and detachment. In fact, prayer and meditation are only effective in proportion to our renunciation and detachment. When these two, prayer, spiritual disciplines, and the discipline of and the practice of detachment and renunciation, when these are combined, then it becomes possible for us to control our mind and purify it. Now, whatever we like attracts our mind and creates bondage. But love can also lead to hatred. Attachment can lead to aversion, the very opposite. They are only two sides of the same coin, the same thing turned upside down. They are not essentially different. This some of us know by personal experience. So we must try to get rid of all forms of bondage and fear by becoming dispassionate and free from strong personal likes and dislikes. We should never have any personal claim on anybody, nor should we allow anybody to have any personal claim on us. Nobody owns anything in God's world. Nothing is anybody's personal property. If we possess anything, we possess it only as trustees and not as owners. Our only duty is to administer and serve others in God's name. Holy Mother says, serve others, but love God alone. Your love has to be given to God alone. So as spiritual aspirants, we must love God alone and let others also do the same. If we love other people more than God, or allow them to love us more than God, neither of us will be worthy of God. We will never succeed in spiritual life that way. We only reap what we sow. As long as we keep binding ourselves and others with our likes and dislikes, we remain bond slaves, bringing misery not only to ourselves, but also to others. Misery, as they say, misery is the penalty we pay for our attachments. The result may come sooner or later, but all have to pay for their folly. However, there is one exception that Sri Ramakrishna makes here in the matter of loving people, loving others. Sri Ramakrishna said that the case of spiritual aspirants or devotees of God is different. Devotees of God belong to each other because they are all bound by the common bond of divine love, which is pure and permanent. Love for one's spiritual brothers and sisters is certainly deeper than worldly love, and it is surely beneficial to spiritual life. That is the relationship we see among the disciples of Jesus Christ and Sri Ramakrishna. What deep love, what mutual respect and consideration existed between them. Only that kind of spiritual love is genuine, pure, and unselfish. The so-called love of worldly people is very often only polished self-interest. And now comes the surprise. The surprise is, it is these spiritual people whose love is so pure and so unselfish. It is they who teach us renunciation and detachment. That means renunciation and detachment is not indifference or lack of consideration for others. That kind of callousness is not non-attachment. It is nothing but selfishness. It is nothing but preserving one's own ego. What the great souls intend to teach is that we should serve others as best as we can without getting attached to anybody. If we feel we don't have the strength to do this, without jeopardizing our own spiritual aspirations, let us just pray to God for their welfare. If our prayers are sincere and intense, that means if we really love those people that we wish to help, we will find help reaching them. But still, to be able to pray, we should first of all feel ourselves close to God. So love of God certainly comes first, before we get down to helping others. When Now, when we first turn from worldly life to spiritual life, in the beginning, we may feel a little indifferent towards others. It is quite common and natural. But this is just a period of transition. And this period of transition is only for the time being. If we stick to the ideal of God realization and continue to lead a pure life, we will see our old love returning in a much more elevated form, in a purified form. Then we love others not out of any superficial attraction or selfish motives, but because we feel God's presence in them. We see them as God's children, as sparks of the same fire. And this alone is real love. Speaking of friends and relatives, after all, who are our true friends and relatives? Spiritual people, devotees of God. Very often, the people we think are our near and dear ones often turn out to be perfect strangers. They live on one thought plane and we on another. So, if we are eager to progress quickly, sometimes it becomes necessary to live like strangers among our own people. And if they try to drag us down, the only way is to part company. This is the hard truth of spiritual life. If we want to move on and they want to lie down, what else can we do? So we need to develop a more realistic perspective with regard to our family and friends. Realistic from the spiritual point of view. We need to free the mind from all old associations because they are mostly connected with purely human emotions and sentiments. If we want to become spiritual, then we have to cultivate the spiritual perspective. And the best way of doing this is by thinking of the impersonal spirit more and more. The thought of the divine spirit dwelling in all beings, that will loosen our clinging to human forms. We must think this thought so constantly and so instantly that it becomes a reality to us. Then it will sustain us when all our ideas and dreams about others are broken, as it usually happens. Otherwise, when we are disappointed with others, we become angry and bitter. And hatred is as bad as love. Aversion is as bad as attachment. It is not that one is better than the other. Both create bondage, both degrade us, both prevent us from rising to our true stature. So, both have to be renounced. Why do we become angry? Only because somebody didn't meet our expectations, or because something is standing in the way of our enjoyment. In the last analysis, this is the only reason for all our anger. And anger is closely connected with an overstressed ego. Without a strong sense of ego or an excessive desire for enjoyment, anger could never even rise in our hearts. If we do not desire any enjoyment, if we do not expect anything from everybody, we can never be angry. As the Bhagavad Gita says, desire and anger, kama and krodha, these are the two greatest enemies on our path. And without eliminating them, it is impossible to progress in spiritual life. So, wherever there is anger, there is some attachment with the hope of enjoyment. It may not be a gross form of enjoyment, it should be understood in a more subtle sense. Still, gross or subtle, it is our frustrated desire for enjoyment that gives rise to anger. Sometimes, especially in the early stages of our spiritual life, we become easily irritable or short-tempered. That is because our renunciation is still half-hearted. Outer renunciation is not yet followed by inner detachment. Then what happens is the inner attachment conflicts with the outer detachment, and that creates mental tension. So true renunciation must be renunciation of the feelings, of the tendency for attachment and aversion. So we see that in the beginning, spiritual practice produces both good and bad results. When we water the garden well, we get not only fine flowers, but also plenty of weeds. So we will have to do a lot of weeding, cutting, and uprooting. This renunciation and detachment is a continual process of clearing the jungle within. All of us here have a little fire, a little flame of renunciation burning in our heart. We see it glow, at least sometimes. But then we dump the rubbish of worldliness on it, and the little flame dies out. Our love for the world kills the little flame of love of God that we have. So the flame of renunciation and divine love have to be kept alive. It needs constant care. Otherwise, the bad associations and outgoing tendencies of our mind will extinguish it. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, it is like protecting a tender young plant by raising a hedge around it. Otherwise, it will be eaten up by stray cattle, and it will never grow up into a big, sturdy tree. In the same way, when we sacrifice, when we let go of all our personal relations and attachments, the little flame of renunciation will grow into a blazing fire and destroy all worldliness and set us free. Now, all this is one part of the story, because according to Sri Ramakrishna, renunciation and detachment have to go hand in hand with love of God. Without love of God, without devotion to one spiritual ideal, spiritual life becomes dry and difficult. But when renunciation is accompanied by love of God, spiritual life becomes a most joyful journey. Divine love fulfills everything. In this sense, for a lover of God, there is no sacrifice or giving up. There is no renunciation as such, but only fulfillment. Because this pure divine love finds expression in love for all in general, without being limited to particular individuals. It is something liberating. If we can develop this new outlook, our life will change altogether because it breaks down all barriers. It bursts all bonds. It makes us limitless. Then we become channels for the free flow of divine energy. So we must first make room for God in our hearts. True renunciation, in its positive aspect, means filling the heart with God. Generally, it is burdened with desires and passions. To the extent we are able to get rid of this worldly burden, to that extent we feel more of the divine presence within. If we are able to shift our center of consciousness from the ego to God, then we will find that everybody and everything has a place in God. It is God alone who can give us permanent happiness to our soul. He is the source of all happiness. But though He lives right here within our heart as the soul of our soul, we ignore Him and run after external objects. It is like ignoring the real thing and running after reflections and shadows. Really, as a matter of fact, we live on desires and false hopes, which only bring us misery, bondage, and slavery, because they are dependent on other things, on other people. If we give up those false, worldly hopes, we are sure to be happy. Our only hope should be connected with God, should be centered on Him, dependent on Him alone. All other hopes connected with our desires and urges must be given up. Let us not hope for anything worldly. Let us hope only for God. This is the first sign of true dispassion for the world, love of God. Without this basic quality of dispassion, spiritual life cannot even begin. And that is not enough. It should become our dominant trait if we want to be really spiritual. We must be established in that. So the spirit of renunciation has to be there. It may not come to us suddenly or dramatically, like we find in the lives of saints and mystics. But we must not be so foolish as to wait until all our desires are satisfied. That is never going to happen. Desires and impulses keep rising within endlessly, owing to our tendencies and past experiences. That is the very nature of desire, to keep multiplying and never to be satisfied. But that is no reason why we should we should feel helpless against them. We can and we must put them down. Of course, it may all take time and mean great strain and inner conflict for some period. We have to struggle very hard at self-control in the beginning, but it is unavoidable. This is the minimum required to start the spiritual life. This early phase has to be passed through by every aspirant. But the sooner we start, the better. When we really start practicing true renunciation, we will realize what sort of wretched life we were living until then. When we realize our mistake in life, the first reaction we feel for our worldliness is disgust. My words, please. They're not my words. Disgust not for the world, but for our own worldliness. That's an important difference. It's a strong expression, I know, but that is what happens. But then it's a sign of a radical transformation. It is a definite turn from worldly life to spiritual life. We can ourselves find out whether we have surely turned to spiritual life. If we have that feeling of disgust, the world will no longer attract us, and nothing in the world will be an obstacle in our way. Patanjali himself says, when one practices both inner and outer purity, one develops an aversion for one's own body and a revulsion for coming into contact with other bodies. It's not enough to know these things superficially unless we are able to also react emotionally to these teachings, to respond instinctively. Our spirituality is never safe. But cases of such clear-cut or complete change are rare. As we heard, most people are only slightly better than the camel of Sri Ramakrishna's parable. Their renunciation is half-hearted even after receiving heavy blows in life. After a brief fit of renunciation, they get entangled in the world all the more. So why? Why does this happen? The reason is, most of the time, we lack inner detachment. Simply by giving up the world outwardly, we don't become pure in thought, word, and deed. It is easier to give up a bad habit than it is to give up a bad thought. It is easier to avoid worldly company, but the internal company of our own old thoughts and tendencies is far more difficult to shake off. It is this inner company that is more troublesome and more dangerous. Here, prayer and discrimination are our only help. Through ceaseless prayer and constant discrimination, we have to detach ourselves from all those old images. We should keep removing the old dirt and be careful not to gather fresh dirt. Gradually, we will find our mind becoming cleaner and stronger. During all these struggles on both physical and mental levels, we should try to think of God as much as possible. We can do this with the help of prayer or japa. We can place before God all the contents of our mind as the surface and intensely pray to Him to help us get rid of our old impressions and tendencies. In fact, this is something very psychological. Prayer is a very powerful means of clearing the subconscious. We can unburden to somebody we trust without any reservations. That is the psychology behind it. We need not be afraid or ashamed of God. We can offer Him everything, though this is only possible for people who believe in God and have faith in Him. But for others, there is another alternative. Sometimes it is not possible to prevent a bad thought from arising. It happens in spite of ourselves. In that case, we could look at it as we look at a mirage. We know the mirage is unreal, but we still do see it. The phenomenon cannot be altogether stopped, but it can be seen for what it is, just as a phenomenon. Something that appears to be real, but is actually unreal. But the best method is to think of ourselves as witnesses or spectators of our own thoughts and feelings. Just onlookers of everything that comes up, however awful, and try to remain aloof and unaffected by them. We can't get rid of a bad impulse or a feeling without first recognizing it or acknowledging its presence. But so what if there are thousands of impure ideas lying submerged in my mind? What is more important is to keep myself unattached to them. It is only when the conscious mind gets connected to them that they really belong to me and begin to bother me. But if I know that my real self is pure and unattached, I can remain as the witness and be unaffected by impure thoughts. As we become more and more alert and watchful and practice this kind of non-identification, we will be able to keep bad thoughts at a safe distance. This higher form of detachment, this interior detachment of the self, is a great help. We need to think more and more of our real nature and stop identifying ourselves, stop worrying about our thoughts, good or bad. Slowly, this practiced detachment will become natural and spontaneous, and we will be able to rise above our thoughts and remain as the pure Atman. It all happens as the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras says, by practice and detachment. This is the only way, and there is no other way. So this is the whole purpose of renunciation and detachment, to restore us to our original pure nature. And the purpose of prayer and discrimination in this context is to act as aids to renunciation by arousing our spiritually dull and lazy mind and making it alert and sharp through constant struggle. These are the tools we have at our disposal: prayer and discrimination on the one hand, and renunciation and detachment on the other, with which we can start working on ourselves. It involves much work, lots of work, and the tools can't be laid down until we have perfected ourselves. Now, before we bring this long discussion to a close, let us quickly recapitulate what we learned from it. First of all, the need for renunciation. Second, the difference between love and attachment. Thirdly, who our true relatives are. Fourth, love of God or love of the spiritual ideal as the better part of renunciation. Then, replacing false hopes with dependence on the divine. And developing a feeling of aversion or disgust, not for the world, but for our own worldliness. 7, the importance of inner detachment. And finally, identification with our true self. All this Sri Ramakrishna has said so simply and so effectively in his mudfish analogy. As we go about our day-to-day lives, whenever we are faced with the challenge of how to harmonize life in the world with spirituality, how to integrate our secular duties with spiritual life, we only have to remember and try our best to practice these two simple instructions. Live in the world like a maidservant in a rich man's house. Live in the world like a mudfish in the mud. A maidservant in the house of a rich man, I repeat, because it is easier to remember. A maidservant in the house of a rich man performs all the household duties, but her thoughts are fixed on her own home in her native village. She brings up her master's children as if they were her own. She even speaks of them as my Ram or my Hari. But in her own mind, she knows very well that they do not belong to her at all. Then, the mudfish lives in the mud, but itself remains unstained. The mud is there, and the fish has to live in it. But its body is not stained by the mud. Its skin is always bright and shiny. You should live in the world in a spirit of detachment. You may have dirt on your body, but you must shake it off as the mudfish shakes off the mud. And one last thing before I finally conclude this talk. This is something Swami Saradanandaji. As you know, Saradanandaji was a direct monastic disciple of Sri Ramakrishna and his most authentic biographer. Saradanandaji used to tell aspiring monastics, young people, it is not necessary that everyone become a monk. The aim of the scriptures is to teach people how to develop the spirit of renunciation in married life. Through experience in the world, with its joys and sorrows, they will come to know the value of detachment, without which no happiness can be had. Gradually, they will understand that the joys of the world are short-lived and unreal, and that the only reality is God. This is the path of living in the world but not being of the world. If a person performs their duties properly and their life embodies the spirit of detachment throughout, they will ultimately attain the highest ideal. So there is hope for everybody, regardless of whether they are monks or lay. They will see God in everything and attain pure knowledge, which will burn all the seeds of karma. They will not be born again, and their soul will merge into Brahman at the dissolution of the body. The great ones make no distinction between monastic and lay, but they are very, very firm about the disciplines, about the internal disciplines that everyone has to follow. Sharadanandji continues, there is no guarantee that you will accomplish your purpose simply by renouncing the world. There is no guarantee that you will accomplish your purpose simply by renouncing the world. On the contrary, if you stay in the world, you will have to face resistance, which will turn your mind to God. This is the experience of all householders. In an immature state, if one renounces the world without facing any resistance, one loses one's attraction to God. That is the risk of monastic life. How one will reach God, he alone knows. So let us keep these words in mind, and may the great Master give us the power to understand and assimilate these valuable teachings.